Welcome back to my channel and the second part of a three-part series in response to Cosmic Skeptic's video called How the Bible Supports Slavery. In this video, we're going to be talking about what a lot of the critics of the Bible are convinced proves beyond any reasonable doubt that the Bible supports slavery. But in my mind, we haven't even got warmed up yet. So stick around to the end of the video because I'm convinced that today's video is only going to get better and better. Usually when I record a video, I want to hear the absolute best objections and arguments against my position, so that way I can take them into consideration before I even record my video. In this case, I watched as many videos from skeptics on this topic as I could find, and what I found is that there's really only two main verses that skeptics use in order to justify their position that the Bible supports slavery. And that's when I realized that those two passages are the very best passages that they have in support of their position. So they really need those passages. They need them like a fat kid needs cake. They need them like Jussie Smollett needed the Obamas. They need them like I need Chick-fil-A on a Sunday. They need them like some online atheists need to call everyone who disagrees with them dishonest. And the beautiful thing is that Cosmic Skeptic's argument is no exception. In the video, he argued most of his position from those two passages, and those two passages are the ones we're going to be talking about today. So, are you guys excited? I know I am. Let's go! So I think it's actually pretty easy to pinpoint where exactly me and Cosmic Skeptic disagree. And so we're clear. There's about 5 things I can think of that make slavery so morally wrong, and Cosmic Skeptic seems to think that these two passages teach these things. 1. Being kidnapped and taken against your will. 2. Stripped of all your rights. 3. The slaver can beat you and abuse you as much as he wishes since you're his property. In other words, he's treating you as a thing rather than a person. 4. There's no compensation or benefit for you, only the slaver benefits. And 5. You're forced to stay for life against your will. Now, Cosmic Skeptic and I both agree that this is horrendous and we both find it repulsive. Now, I thought I was clear here, but apparently some commenters pulled a Kathy Newman on me saying that I was actually saying that I was in support of slavery. Me? When the Bible talks about slavery, it doesn't always mean what you think it does. Brainless commenters. So you're saying you're a black man who supports slavery. You're a disgusting human being. No, that's not what I said. Again, Cosmic Skeptic and I are on the same page here. We both find it repulsive. Our disagreement comes over the passages that he mentions and if it actually teaches those things or not. Now, I said it before and I'll say it again, I tend to like the kid and he doesn't strike me as an intentionally dishonest person, so it's nothing personal. It's just his arguments that I have a problem with. So let's just go through the passages as they come up in his video and we'll check back at the end of the video to see where we land. So let's pick up right from where we left off last time.
So what kind of slavery are we really dealing with in the Bible? We haven't actually seen any references yet, so let's take a minute to explore what slavery did mean in the Bible and to consider the religious defense that the slavery condoned in the Bible is not slavery as we'd recognize it today. This is a defense that the guy in this video speaks about next, so let's listen.
Number 2, the purpose of slavery in the Bible, as we're getting ready to see, was actually designed to help the poor survive, which was the exact opposite of what was practiced in our country for nearly 400 years.
This is true.
This leads me to my third point, which is that in the Hebrew culture, slavery was primarily volitional. So in other words, if a person was too poor to provide for themselves or if they were in debt, they would oftentimes hire themselves out to someone who was richer who could provide for them or pay off all of their debt.
This is also true. Slavery was primarily volitional. Okay, now I want you to think about something. What is the first thing you think of when you hear the word gay? And I know this is a really weird question, but just bear with me. Now, with that in mind, remember that we used to understand the word to mean happy. Back in the day, if you picked up a book on being gay, you'd be expecting something completely different than you would be if you picked up a book on being gay today. So would it be dishonest of you for you to tell somebody that the word gay means something different now than it used to mean? I don't think so. Not to mention, a lot of people use the word gay today to talk about things instead of people. The point is here, words are just signposts. In order to understand what's meant by the word, we first need to understand the context that the word is being used in. And this is true of all human language. And my position is something similar is going on when we read about slavery in the Bible. And I think Cosmic Skeptic would agree with me on this point as well. And that's why he spends a lot of time talking about the context. He's talking about what is meant by the word. The good news is this can actually settle me and Cosmic Skeptic's disagreement. Either the context of these passages supports his understanding or they don't. Let's keep going.
Others would choose to be slaves to ensure that all of their basic needs were met by their master. Either way, slavery in the Hebrew culture was volitional.
True again. Parr was factually correct on all 3 points. So, now back to you, Mr. Cosmic. What say you?
Okay, so there's a lot there and there's some level of truth to this, but let's actually analyze one of the most explicit references to slavery made in the Bible to see what we're really dealing with. Atheists are quick to point to chapters like Leviticus 25 to prove that the Bible condones slavery, so let's take a look at verses 44 to 46 from this chapter.
And like a moth to a flame, they just cannot resist this verse. As Tecton TV says,
when it comes to the Bible and slavery, there's one passage that fundy atheists love so much that I wonder if they sleep in pajamas decorated with it. I'm talking about Leviticus 25, 42 through 46.
But if this verse and the next verse that we're going to be talking about doesn't prove what they think it proves, then that means that the case that the Bible supports slavery is incredibly weak, because these verses are the absolute best that they could come up with. So let's get back into it.
So let's take a look at verses 44 to 46 from this chapter. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. That last point, by the way, about the Israelites highlights the tribalism of the Bible, since it's condoning slavery, but only when the slaves are taken from other nations.
Well, on the face of it, this verse surely does seem to support his point. As we'll see, he seems to believe that this passage proves the 4 following points. 1. That slaves could be kidnapped from other nations. 2. Foreign slaves can be treated as just property, meaning that they don't have any rights, the owner can abuse them, and the owner can do with them as they please. So in other words, foreign slaves are essentially things instead of people. 3. That foreign slaves are forced into becoming slaves for life against their will. And 4. That the Bible only condones slavery when it comes to foreigners. Now what's interesting is that I understand the passage in almost the exact opposite way. I don't think that the passage supports any of those points. So here's how I understand what's going on in the passage. So when we look at the Hebrew, the people that are mentioned in this passage are called the Toshab, the sojourners, and also the Gar, the foreigners. The Gar and the Toshab are people who come from another land who wanted to find refuge in Israel for one reason or another. Presumably for political reasons, economic reasons, religious reasons, such as they embraced Yahweh, or perhaps they ran away from or were exiled from their nation. So I understand that people in this passage sold themselves into slavery and were not kidnapped against their will. Nor was it commanded for them to stay for life. Instead, it was a permission. So how did Cosmic Skeptic and I come to such radically different perspectives on this passage by reading the same verses? Am I just reading this passage with rose-colored glasses because I'm too scared to see what the Bible actually says? Or is Cosmic Skeptic isolating this verse and reading his modern understanding of slavery into the passage? Now from the outside, just reading this verse by itself, it does look like I'm on the outs on this one. But before we jump to conclusions, let's unpack this just a bit further.
So what else can we take from this excerpt? Well, take note of the language used to describe the slaves. Quote, they will become your property. Even if someone is treated well, there's no excuse for considering a human being as property.
So the obvious question here is, what is meant by property? As we saw in the last video, the word used for slave, abad or abed, is a morally neutral word and it's not intrinsically negative. Property seems to be similar. On Cosmic Skeptic's understanding of the word property in this passage, the word is clearly derogatory. He seems to think that the word property here implies that a person doesn't have any rights, the owner can do with them as they please, the owner can hold them against their will, and the owner can abuse them. But as we just saw, the passage is about the Toshab and the Gar, the sojourner and the foreigner. His translation says temporary residents among you. The other translations say sojourner or foreigner, which is a lot easier. So going forward, to make it easier for all of us, I'm just going to say foreigner. So if we back up just a few chapters in Leviticus, we see another place where God is talking about the same people, the Toshab who's living as the Gar. The passage says, when a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. You shall love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. I am the Lord, your God. Huh. Interesting. So just a few passages before the passage that Cosmic Skeptic cited, we read that the Israelites were commanded to not mistreat them, to love them as they love themselves, and also to remember that they too were foreigners. Interesting. Interesting indeed. But maybe it was a fluke, who knows? Maybe it was some sort of special context. So let's just go to another book. How about Exodus? In Exodus, we read again, Do not oppress a foreigner. You yourselves knows how it feels to be foreigners because you were foreigners in Egypt. Also in Exodus, do not mistreat or oppress a foreigner, for you were foreigners in Egypt. What about Deuteronomy? Cursed is anyone who withholds justice from the foreigner, the fatherless, or the widow. Or how about in Deuteronomy 10:19, where we read, For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who shows no partiality and accepts no bribes. He defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow, and loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing. And you are to love those who are foreigners, for you yourselves were foreigners in Egypt. And there's plenty of verses like this. So now, where are the verses that say that you can treat these foreigners like a piece of furniture? To make matters more confusing, Cosmic Skeptic ends his reading at verse 46, but when we pick up at verse 47, we read how not only could these servants become rich, but they could also own other servants. So let me get this straight. The foreigners were not to be oppressed, were not to be mistreated. The Israelites were cursed if they withheld justice from the foreigners. The foreigners had the potential to become rich. They could also have slaves themselves. And the Israelites were commanded to love them. And not just love them as much as they love themselves. So if we read this verse in isolation, and we also had the concept of slavery in our minds that we learned in school growing up, then it would seem to prove his point. But if we read more than just this verse, then it becomes clear that the word property couldn't possibly mean what Cosmic Skeptic believes it to mean. So what about my understanding? How do I understand the word property? My understanding of the word property here in Hebrew, ahuzah, is not in reference to a person's value, but instead it's in reference to the value of their labor output. This is made even clearer when we continue reading where Cosmic Skeptic left off and read verses 49 through 53. Here it's clear that the redemption price is not based on the person as an object, but instead it's based on the value of their labor output. But let's just say that I'm wrong. And let's just say that the Hebrew word here is in reference to the person rather than the work that they do. Even if that were the case, we do know one thing for certain. We know for certain that the word couldn't possibly mean what Cosmic Skeptic believes it to mean, given the dozen of verses that describe the foreigners of having rights, commanded to be loved and taken care of, and also not being treated like a beat-up couch. So once we understand what the word can't mean, it helps us to be able to understand what the word does mean. And this changes how we understand the language of buying and selling. This could be similar to what's meant today when we talk about buying and selling and trading sport players. When we talk about sport players being bought and sold, we don't mean that they don't have value. Instead, what we're referring to is the work that they perform. So the only point I want to make from this analogy about the sports players is that you can use that language without saying that the person has no value. All you have to do is look at the context in which the language is being used.
And as the 46th verse here says, the slaves mentioned in this part of the Bible can be inherited by the children of the original owner, and you can, quote, make them slaves for life. If God is giving the Israelites authority to indefinitely enslave people of other nations and make them slaves for life, these people were not simply workers or in some kind of voluntary dependent relationship agreement. They're not free to leave. This is outrageous, regardless of how they're being treated.
So as I said earlier, Cosmic Skeptic has taken this verse to mean that God is commanding the Hebrews not to release foreigners. And my view is that God was giving them permission to keep the foreigners rather than instructing them to keep the foreigners. So how did I come to that conclusion? Well, I just took into consideration the context of what's being talked about. So here's what's going on here. This chapter is talking about the year of Jubilee. The verses right before the passage that Cosmic Skeptic quotes, in the passages, God is talking about the Hebrew servants working until the year of Jubilee and then being released back to their own land. And that the year of Jubilee, all debts are to be wiped free. It's like hitting the reset button on the economy. All debts are canceled and everybody goes home. So then the question arises, how does this work for the foreigner when they don't have any land to go back to? Well, if most or all of them couldn't go back home for whatever reason, then it seems that God's given them the permission to stay permanently if they wish. Notice the language here. Is God commanding them to stay for life? In the passage, God is saying you can or you may. He's not saying that you must or you shall. This seems to be given permission. It's not like earlier when we read in Leviticus where God commanded the Israelites by saying, you shall love them as you love yourselves. In my survey of the words Toshab and Gar, there's only a few times when there were exceptions for the foreigners, and in those times it was directly related to the land. So it had nothing to do with race, it was about the land. So if the foreigners wanted to come stay, they could, and this isn't as grim as Cosmic Skeptic tries to make it out to be, especially given the fact that the Israelites were commanded to love them, treat them good, not oppress them, and so on. But again, I always like to consider the fact that I could be wrong here. So let's say that I am wrong here and they weren't allowed to go and they had to stay for life. Still, we have no indication in the text at all that they were kidnapped or forced to come to Israel against their will. By the way, where does it say in this verse that you can kidnap these slaves from other nations? Take a look. I don't see it. Do you? In fact, there's other verses that give the death penalty for stealing people. The only way that this can even seem like a possibility is if we have the modern idea of slavery in our minds when we're reading this passage. So if I was wrong and that was the case, then it seems that the foreigners are being offered, you can come to Israel, but you have to stay permanently. Not to mention, in Deuteronomy we read, "You shall not give up to a master a slave who has escaped from his master to you. He shall dwell with you in your midst, in the place that he shall choose within one of your towns, wherever it suits him. You shall not wrong him." The other translations say that you shall not oppress him or you shall not mistreat him. So here we read that the Israelites were commanded to take in runaway slaves, not to return them to their masters, that the slave could stay wherever he would like, and that you're not to do them wrong. So perhaps you might be thinking, well then this must be referring to the Hebrew slaves. I disagree. But even if so, then this would fly directly in the face of the other verse that he quotes that we'll be discussing here in a little bit.
But hold on, how then do we explain the verse this guy mentions in his video that suggests that slaves can choose whether or not to leave? Let's look again. "But if the servant declares, 'I love my master and do not want to go free,' then he will be his servant for life." I just argued that slaves have no choice in whether to be slaves or not, but this quote from Exodus 21 seems to clearly state that slaves can choose whether to be slaves for life or not. So how do we square this? Well, like I say, this guy quoted Exodus 21 verses 5 to 6, but let's back up a little bit and read from verse 2. We get the following. "If you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve you for 6 years. But in the 7th year he shall go free without paying anything," and so on and so forth, up to the quote this guy used that the slave himself can decide whether or not to be a slave for life. This is the element of truth I was referring to, but pay close attention. These verses are referring specifically to Hebrew servants, not slaves taken from other nations. It's the slaves taken from other nations who are the ones mentioned in Leviticus. So the guy in the video is quoting verses that relate to the, at least partially, voluntary service of Hebrew individuals, not verses relating to the regulation of slaves taken from foreign nations. These, the foreign slaves, are the ones who we should be concerned about. He's quoting regulations about the wrong people. This is a prime example of the Bible being taken out of context. And I don't just mean the context of the time it was written or something like that, but the context of the very sentences within it.
First off, Parr is talking about slavery overall, as almost every skeptic I've ever heard talk about slavery does. From what I've seen, the skeptics always quote 2 verses, Leviticus and Exodus 21. For Cosmic Skeptic to make it appear as though Parr had Cosmic Skeptic's distinctions of the Hebrew and the non-Hebrew Israelite in mind goes back to what we talked about in the last video. Cosmic Skeptic is still assuming that Parr is in some sort of imaginary debate with them.
But even if we ignore this and only talk about the Hebrew servants mentioned in Exodus 21, we've still got problems. How were these servants treated? Well, let's take a look at one of these regulations, shall we? Exodus chapter 21, verses 20 to 21. And this verse comes just after the one the guy quoted in the video regarding Hebrew servants. "Anyone who beats their male or female slaves with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result, but they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or 2, since the slave is their property." Okay, so it's perfectly permissible to mercilessly beat your slaves with a rod as much as you want, and this should only be punishable if the slave dies as a, quote, direct result. If they get up after a few days, everything's fine. In what world should we consider this acceptable moral guidance? You, Mr. Video Maker, were the one who brought up the regulations on slavery, and you were the one who quoted Exodus 21 to defend your position. All I'm doing is actually looking up the things that you're referencing in the Bible and actually reading what's there. Maybe you should try it sometime.
Oh man, where do we start? First, where does it say that this is in reference to Hebrew slaves? passage says nothing about this only referring to Hebrew slaves. From what I understand, the laws are for everyone, and if there is going to be a difference between the Hebrew and the non-Hebrew, then the passage will specify. Otherwise, it's referring to the laws of Israel, and everybody living in Israel is under that law. But second, he is once again factually wrong. Does this verse say,
"It's perfectly permissible to mercilessly beat your slaves with a rod as much as you want. If they get up after a few days, everything's fine"?
Is that what this verse is really saying? Or is he once again reading this verse out of context and inserting his modern understanding of slavery into the context? But surely, he can't be reading this verse out of context, could he? Immediately before this passage, and I mean literally just sentences before he quoted the passage, he complained about people not reading the very sentences in the passage.
This is a prime example of the Bible being taken out of context. And I don't just mean the context of the time it was written or something like that, but the context of the very sentences within it.
He then goes in on par, shunning them for being so terrible as to not read the following passages in order to get the right context.
All I'm doing is actually looking up the things that you're referencing in the Bible and actually reading what's there. Maybe you should try it sometime.
But what happens when we read the verses immediately after the ones that Cosmic Skeptic just read? Well, let's see. An owner who hits a male or female slave in the eye and destroys it must let the slave go free to compensate for the eye. And an owner who knocks out the tooth of a male or female slave must let the slave go free to compensate for the tooth. So what we've learned here is that a slave can go free if he's abused. So it's just wrong to say that he can be beat mercilessly and be forced to stay. The very thing that he condemned Parr for is literally the exact same thing that he himself is guilty of. You just can't make this kind of stuff up. If he actually took his own advice and just read the next few verses, then he would understand that what he took from the verse 20 and 21, and I quote,
"It's perfectly permissible to mercilessly beat your slaves with a rod as much as you want, and this should only be punishable if the slave dies as a, quote, direct result. If they get up after a few days, everything's fine."
Then he would have realized how wrong he was. The passage couldn't possibly mean that you could beat a slave within an inch of their life, and as long as the slave doesn't die, then you get away scot-free. So now we have an explicit statement just a couple verses later that says that there is punishment if you abuse your slaves. Now, as funny as this is, we're still left with the question of what's actually meant by verses 20 and 21. Let's read them again. "Anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result. But they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property." The word being used here for punish is nakam, which is specifically talking about the death penalty as it does every other time in the Old Testament. So all this passage is saying is that if you kill a slave, then you get the death penalty. You take a life, you lose a life. A life for a life. Uh-oh. Is he pulling a Kathy Newman on the Bible? Bible. You kill a slave, you get the death penalty. Cosmic Skeptic. So you're saying we can beat them all we like, even within an inch of life. There's nothing special about an eye or a tooth, by the way. The passage is saying that you can't abuse your slaves. So here we actually have Cosmic Skeptic reading his own context into the verse, looking down on Christians and accusing them of doing the very thing that he's doing. Yeah. But really, Cosmic Skeptics still seem to miss the commonsensical fact that if you hurt or kill your slave, you don't benefit. You lost your worker, now you have to do all of the work yourself, and you don't get paid. You don't win in that situation. Now, once again, recall what we read earlier in Deuteronomy about the runaway slave. If you remember, the Israelites were commanded to take in the runaway slave, not to return them to their master. The slave could stay wherever he would like, and you're not to oppress them, mistreat them, or do them wrong. So if this passage applies to the Hebrew slave rather than the non-Hebrew slave, then this flies directly in the face of the argument that you can beat your Hebrew slave as much as you like and they have to take it as long as they survive. But if the Hebrew slaves were commanded to just take a beating, as he seems to argue for, then why is it that the Israelites were commanded to take them in and care for them if they ran away? Why were they commanded to not return them to their harsh masters and not oppress them, mistreat them, or do them wrong? Looks like they had a way out if they wanted. They could literally go wherever they wanted to go. So at this point, you might be saying, well, then this verse must not apply to the Hebrew slave. But if it doesn't apply to the Hebrew slave, then it would apply to the non-Hebrew slave, the one that we talked about in Leviticus 25:44-46. But if this is the case, it still seems to be at odds with the Leviticus passage as he understood it. He understood the passage to be a command that the foreigners could be treated like a dumpster and forced not to leave. But again, if this is true, then why were the Israelites commanded to take care of them, not to return them to their masters, let them live wherever they would like, and not to do them wrong, mistreat them, or oppress them? If they truly were forced to stay for life, then you would think that they would be punished for running away. But even at that, they're commanded not to oppress them or mistreat them. And that flies directly in the face of the view that the foreign slaves could be oppressed and treated poorly. Once again, this seems to clearly argue against his understanding of the passages, and it seems to fit nice and smoothly with my understanding of the passages. But one more time, let's just consider the fact that I could be wrong once again, and he's correct on his understanding of both passages. So in his understanding, the Exodus passage says that you can beat your Hebrew slaves as much as you like as long as they don't die. And he understands the Leviticus passage to say that you can treat the non-Hebrew slave much, much worse. Think about that. Do you see the issue here? If you can beat a Hebrew slave as much as you want, as long as they don't die, and you can treat the non-Hebrew slave far worse than you can treat the Hebrew, then that would mean that you could kill the non-Hebrew slave, because that's the only thing that's worse than beating them within an inch of their life. But of course this isn't true, especially given all the passages that we read earlier about how you're supposed to love them and care for them and don't do them wrong, and to treat the non-Hebrews the way that you treat the Hebrews. So either way, even if we accepted his apparent misunderstanding of these passages, they still want to be coherent, argued in the way that he argues for them. And this is also consistent with the commonsensical fact that you do not hurt or kill your slave. If you hurt your slave, they can run away and they can go stay with someone else, and the Israelites are commanded to take them in and also not to do them wrong.
If they get up after a few days, everything's fine. In what world should we consider this acceptable moral guidance?
That's a good question. May I be so brave as to say a world where there's no moral absolutes, where all morals are subjective, where morals are illusory, and where they're just opinions? I'm talking about the world that Cosmic Skeptic himself believes that we live in.
Imagine if your boss could beat you as much as he wanted as long as you didn't die. It's ridiculous.
That is ridiculous. Keep slugging at that straw man, buddy. You're getting them pretty good.
All I'm doing is actually looking up the things that you're referencing in the Bible and actually reading what's there.
The lie detector test determined that was a lie.
Oh my God!
Now, if you think about it, if the Bible does condemn kidnapping people, treating them like property, abusing them, and so on, then it seems the Bible does flat out condemn the things that Cosmic Skeptic finds so repulsive about the slavery that he reads about in the Bible after all.
You, Mr. Videomaker, were the one who brought up the regulations on slavery, and you were the one who quoted Exodus 21 to defend your position. All I'm doing is actually looking up the things that you're referencing in the Bible and actually reading what's there. Maybe you should try it sometime.
You, Mr. Skeptic, are reading Exodus 21 to support your position. All I'm doing is reading them in context and reading what's there. Maybe you should try it sometime. So that does it for part 2. The next part is our final part of the series, in which we're going to be talking about the sex slaves and the racism that Cosmic Skeptic believes is approved in the Bible. So it should be a good one. Hope to see you guys there. So if you're not already in the playlist, go ahead and click right here, and I'll see you guys over at that next one. And what do you mean?